Ever wondered why some groundbreaking research never makes it to market? The answer often lies in one critical step: licensing. Today, we're diving into licensing considerations, the essential framework that transforms your research from lab discovery into real-world impact. Whether you're protecting your innovation, negotiating with partners, or building a commercialization strategy, understanding licensing is the key to unlocking the true value of your intellectual property. Let's get started.
Welcome. Key thing from today is just to help you get an understanding of what licensing is and how it impacts your research realization, understanding some of the terminology used in licensing and how to think about it, how it shapes what we do, and then think about how that turns into terms and the arrangement of the relationship that we want to establish through licensing for commercialization. So when we talk about licensing considerations, we're actually starting to look at how licensing fits into it as a key component of our commercialization approach. We need to understand what we actually want to achieve through licensing for our commercialization activities and use that to understand how do we engage with potential partners and then work with our key advisors, those people who are our licensing experts, who are our intellectual property experts, and who provide us that legal support to get us to a point where we've got an executed agreement that meets the purposes of all parties involved. When we look at that, so this is not going to be chapter and verse in terms of the structure of a licensing agreement. This is actually an output, that's an element, and informs what we're talking about today, but it's actually an end state. What we're trying to do is actually figure out what that licensing arrangement and the considerations we need for that arrangement are going to be on a more practical basis. And that also I'll try to work through today, some of those key terms that are going to shape that as a result. I'm going to take you a step back. When we did the base commercialization webinar series, and if you go and look at commercialization options as one of the webinars, you'll note there that I talk about the license plan, okay? And what the approach is in terms of how we think about licensing as our commercialization plan. The key element in this is that you need to consider that the licensing that you're actually undertaking is actually a transaction, and it's a transaction for an asset, is what we're talking about doing a relationship around. And there's going to be some sort of plan that you put together around how you execute on it, which covers all these things. Again, I've talked about this in previous webinars, but I'm just touching base on it here just so you understand the relationship between the licensing planning and how you're going to execute on that and the research activity you've done. The key areas where they touch are actually around the package or the box. What is it that's being licensed? The duration of when you think that is going to happen, not only to get to the licensing agreement, but there are aspects that we'll talk about through this session around timing and milestones and how that feeds to where that might happen and who's involved in those types of activities. You'll see there, I've got a list of, there are commercialization leads, there are researchers, there are lead researchers, and then there's a number of other stakeholders involved in that process. And again, the key element about that planning activity and what we're trying to get to today is the nature of a license agreement. It's about securing that licensing agreement and having that conversation and realizing the value from the IP that you've generated and the role of the other party in their ability to generate an outcome from it. Another reference I'm going to use today is the Higher Education Research Commercialisation Intellectual Property Framework that's been set up by Australia's Department of Education. It's publicly available and free to use. And my key objective here is not to advocate, this is actually a useful reference, but to use it as a reference that's freely available, has good structure, and provides some commonality of terms, okay? There are going to be slight differences across each organisation, and I'm going to use some of the reference from this framework generally as a guide as we go through the licensing consideration, just so you've got something you can go and have a look at later, or you can see that there's a consistency in some of the thinking that's applied here. You can find it here on this website. The thinking, the framework, just as appropriate here as it is in Australia, as it is in New Zealand, and it's consistent with what you will find in most situations on a global basis. But the other thing to remember is that your institution is going to have its own framework. Start there and work with your commercialization team in terms of what's actually involved in that process, using what you take from today to understand how you can further your conversation, your understanding. When we talk about licensing, we're talking about commercialization, and there are three types of agreements that sit within that. You've got the license, you've got option, or you've got an assignment. The license is a contract for the use of the intellectual property rights. It's where you transfer the rights to use the intellectual property to another party for the purpose of commercialization. An option is where you reserve a right to acquire those rights or to acquire the technology later. So what you're doing is the other party is setting itself up to exercise an option later to take on board, yes, we will actually take that license on, we'll secure the rights, we'll take advantage of that IP, or not. That's what they're buying. They're buying an option to delay the decision around that to a later stage. And there's value in having that option. So that's a transaction as well. And then we're talking about assignment, and that's where you transfer ownership of the rights in the intellectual property from your control to another party's controls. And there's some nuance around that, but it's generally a simpler relationship than the option or the license as a result. Today, we're going to focus mainly on the license aspects because it covers most of the terminology, most of those factors that we need to talk about when we're doing this type of translation of intellectual property rights for commercialization purposes from one party to another. So when we talk about a license, we're talking about rights, okay? We're talking about a license to operate, and that operate is I'm looking to commercialize something. I'm looking to exploit the IP. I'm looking to use it, to develop, to sell, to manufacture, etc. There's a range of different terminology that goes into what is this license about, what's it for? And it's about the ability to use those rights. And you're granting, what that is a grant of the rights to do something, okay? And that license to operate actually grants to the other party a freedom to operate. You're actually granting them the opportunity to go and use that intellectual property rights within the constraints that we set under the licensing agreement, but to give them freedom in that space so that they can undertake that freedom to commercialize, to exploit, to use, to develop, sell, manufacture, etc. But the key question is, what are we licensing? You've heard me previously in this session and in other webinars talk about the box. And that's what we're talking about. I treat it as an asset. It is something that we've defined has value and we can value it. And that we can transfer ownership of that asset through this transaction. And what is it that is being licensed? What does the other party get rights over that's in that box? Generally, it falls into three types of categories. And this is where the definitions of what will actually sit in an agreement actually comes to the fore. We're talking about intellectual property rights. And that can be everything from a patent. It's the rights, it's about designs, plant breeders' rights, all those classical things that we identify as intellectual property. The other component of it is we're starting to talk about material. And so this can actually be physical assets, physical items that intellectual property is embedded in, or how that's expressed, how it's resolved down to that unique insight has actually been created into something that is of value. What is it represented as? And that can be everything from, proofs of concepts, prototypes, it can be documentation. It can be about a process or a methodology. That's an important thing to remember when we're talking about what's in the box, because that is a key consideration for when we talk about translation, transfer. If we're going to go back and give that organization the freedom of operate under the process of the licensing and our consideration of that, are we actually transferring enough of the information, the materials, the insight that actually allows that organization to get the value from what we're doing here? And the last piece is know-how. And there's a very, very clear point here that has to be made on know-how. It's the technical information in documentary form. So this might actually be lab notes and documentation that's associated with it. Note that it's captured in documentary form. So it's been resolved, okay? It excludes the individual's own skills and knowledge. For the purpose of what you're actually defining as the rights around, when we talk about know-how, we're talking about what is actually resolved down into a documentary form, physical form. It's captured. It can be electronic, can be material, physical. But that's what we're talking about there. It's the technical information, not the actual skill of the individual themselves. All right. So that sets the scene in terms of what we're talking about in terms of generally what we're trying to license and for what purpose. Okay. What we're now going to do is we're going to just take a look into some of the key terms and the themes and what that means for licensing, what it means for the nature of the relationship and what you need to understand about licensing as a commercialization activity. The first one you're going to hear is this distinction between what is exclusive and non-exclusive. Okay. When we talk about exclusive as a relationship or as an arrangement, we've got a singular focus. All right. It is, I am going to deal just with you, or I'm going to let you do these things in this field only for full exclusion. All right. So you're favoring somebody else over anybody else to do that work. And that can be a market approach or partner-based. So there's a couple of different ways that we can look at how that plays out. Or we can take a more open approach, is where we define our relationship with multiple parties who want to use it. It's when we get down to the exclusive and non-exclusive and where we draw the lines around allowing people to have that freedom to operate and that a capacity to realize value. There's a key understanding in terms of where we give them enough space to actually realize the value that they wanted to deliver for the outcome that we want to achieve, which is generally going to be a return. We can set exclusivity, non-exclusivity around field. We'll talk to field soon, but the field is around the market and the use of the IP. Where can it be applied? We can talk about territory. So we're talking about physical environments and locations, countries. It can be state-based, it can be global. And we're talking about performance. So there might be aspects around how we set exclusivity to a performance objective. We need to achieve a milestone or we need to achieve an outcome, and we have that sort of relationship. And then we can do a time-based approach to thinking about exclusive and non-exclusive type relationships. We might have, in this particular instance, for the purpose of the negotiation, we're exclusively going to negotiate with you for the next 6 months. If we don't get to a point where we're agreed, we might open that up to other parties. Or once we have the agreement in place, we might sit there and go, okay, we're going to give you exclusivity in this field for the next 2 years for you to have an opportunity to demonstrate that you can generate the outcomes. If you're after that period of time, we're going to open it up to other parties. And across all of those elements, we can get the balance. We can have exclusivity applied to all of that. So we can have an exclusive relationship as a whole that covers everything with field, territory, performance, and time. Or we can make a balance and an adjustment as needed across those dimensions. The key thing about this is what you are saying when you talk about exclusive and non-exclusivity. We are talking about a relationship. We're talking about a relationship between us as the current owner of the intellectual property or that item of value and how we want to engage with it and have that relationship with the counterparty. This is an important distinction when you look at doing a transaction like this. You are trying to establish a relationship. And fundamentally, this exclusivity, non-exclusivity across field, territory, performance, and time are going to be very, very important ways to have that conversation. Let's have a look at field and territory. So when we talk about fields, there are 2 ways that we can look at it. We can talk about it as a market, or we can talk about an application and use. Generally, when we look at the definition of fields and those particular instances, the terms can be used interchangeably. They might use the same terminology for use to represent market, or it might actually be a specific market for this use. And then underneath that, we're thinking about how the rights apply into that specific field. On the other side of that, we start to talk about territory. And territory is where we define the geographical boundaries in which those rights will apply and can be used. Okay. We can actually sit there and go, no, I'm only granting you the rights to Australia, or I'm granting you the rights globally. So there's some distinction in terms of how we can actually tailor and design the relationship and what the licensing arrangement will be. When we look at markets, they can be segmented. You can actually break them down into different market segments. You can divide territories. And we can actually look at applications of use can be broken down and defined specifically. All those three elements actually work together in a range of different ways in terms of how we define and articulate an appropriate licensing arrangement with our parties. This is where we can actually start to look at what the market potential of an IP is, and then how the licensing arrangement translates into the rights that we give to that party to realize value on it. If we have an exclusive arrangement, this can be tailored again under that umbrella, and we can apply exclusivity and non-exclusivity, as I mentioned before, in different ways across these elements, subject to the outcome we want to achieve. Those factors there on the field, they represent the potential or the value that it's going to represent in a market. And it can be an actual market. It can be potential or a real market, one that already exists for those rights. And it's a key determinant of the value and the potential returns that we're going to see from the rights, from this licensing relationship. When we start to look at territories, there's aspects around considering what the intellectual property rights can provide. So if we've got patents, for example, and trademarks, where do they apply? Okay. Do I actually have a global patent? Do I have a patent that covers North America? Okay. If I don't have that, what is the value of that territory in this conversation? All right. It just changes the dynamics. You need to understand how those elements might apply within those particular territories and how that's an expression of what the rights are and the capacity of the other party to realize value from them. Okay. Do these align? Do they change the value of the rights? There's a right for them to pursue patents in a particular territory. There's a number of considerations that fit within that space, depending on what's in the box. Just in terms of tailoring and shaping these types of things and the type of relationship you want to have, the more constrained these are, the less the capacity is to generate scale and return. However, what you might actually also be able to achieve with the party is it increases clarity on area of focus. Right. If I gave you complete access to all markets and all users worldwide, where do you focus? What's the opportunity? How does that shape our relationship? Where does the effort come? How do we work together to realize the value from the IP that we've done? And the other element around that is what can feasibly be delivered. When you try to figure out the relationship that sits here in terms of field and territory, you're actually granting the rights to a market potential or market capacity. Does that align with what the other party can actually do? Does it align with where they are currently operating or their capacity to operate into those areas? In one of my previous roles at Deakin University, I worked on an opportunity where we had to define, in terms of getting to the point of being able to commence our commercialization with our startup, we had to define what the field and the territory were for a particular technology. In this dimension, we actually targeted down into a specific market focus. Although the market focus was a couple of different opportunities, there was a particular application that it was constrained to. And the territories were aligned very much with where that market for that particular application were aligned. And there was the option later on, once to review those fields, to review the territory, to expand that out to more opportunity. Once it established itself, established its operation, demonstrated its value, then there's the capacity to add more into the conversation. Let's talk about sub-licensing. Now, sub-licensing is a very, very important feature of a licensing arrangement. So we might have a relationship where we allow other people to exercise the rights that we've given them. But their capacity to actually then execute on that license to operate, to get that freedom to operate, to deliver on those outcomes, might require that it has the capacity to then allow other people to use the IP as well. And that's generally what you're going to see in a lot of these arrangements. If you go and use your software application and you are licensed for that, any of the IP, any of the background IP, any intellectual property or rights that are embedded in that are licensed or sub-licensed down to you. So that whole chain of where that rights that fit within that cycle pass through each entity or through each party and step down to allow those entities to do what they need to do with it. It allows others to access the right via a sub-license. If you grant me a license, I can then turn around and work with any of my partners, suppliers, customers, and give them a license appropriate for their needs within the constraints or within the bounds of the license I have. And that's where we start to talk about, if I'm the licensee, so I'm the person who's got it, I'm the person who's the partner, the supplier and service providers. We're working with distributors, we're working with agents, people who need to sell, that we need to gain within that cycle. And we're talking about outsourced manufacturing, we're talking about maintenance of software components, maintenance of software systems, anything to do with embedded content in other materials, particularly we're starting to look about the rights to use copyright, to use designs, trademarks, and how we might actually use that, then allow people to provide advice and to work back into us as part of their ability to give us advice back. We're talking about a pass through to customers to the benefit for the IP. So when we talk about the license to use, we're actually giving to the other party that license, and with a sub-license, we want to give the capacity for anybody who uses that IP that's embedded in a product or a service. We want them to have the ability or the rights to use that IP that's embedded in that product or service, so that we follow that chain of rights through the process. If they're doing it for commercial purposes, for personal purposes, those types of considerations are a relationship that the party that you're granting the license to, when they sub-license it down, what is it they're able to do? Well, they need a sufficient license coverage over the top of that that gives them the rights to then sub-license underneath. Which then talks to, are they consistent? So the rights that they need at one end of the chain, are they consistent, and do they track all the way through? Are they comparable? All right. You will hear conversations about pass-through, back-to-back, those types of definitions around how we consider terms and agreements and the rights themselves, that they're consistent across that chain of relationship. There's another important point about sub-license, and it actually comes to what's actually in the form of the agreement we have, and that's about approval of a sub-license. How much control do we, as a licensee, as the person who currently holds the rights, over the other party, the licensee? What is the control that we give them about their ability to grant a sub-license? Do we actually require the capacity to review the sub-licenses they give? Or do we put in there recognizing that the type of environment, the process for commercialization, what they're using those rights for, sits a particular sub-license within this type, and you give that to them without the needs for approval? There's some key considerations when you look at that and the stage of the IP. In each case, you need to be conscious of how you translate the rights through a license, and then the capacity of the other party to then allow them to then share those rights to other parties to achieve the same sort of outcome. Okay, let's start to talk about the money. And that's where we see aspects around royalties, fees, considerations around costs, and when we're going to get payments. So when we look at considerations for licensing, well, what is a royalty? You've probably heard that term, but it's effectively payment that's made by the licensee, the person who's received the rights, from the to the licensor, the person who currently controls them, in exchange for the use of that IP. And they're usually a percentage of net or gross revenue that's made from the IP. Key element there is net and gross revenue from the IP. So there's an attribution activity that needs to sit within that, and understanding what that means as value that adds into the sale of a product or the benefit that's derived from a product or a service that's part of a transaction further down the line. Often paid on a regular basis, can be monthly, can be quarterly, can be annually. When we talk about fees, we're starting to look at specific charges. And so royalties and fees can be sometimes used interchangeably. But here, what I want to do is make a separation between royalties, which are specifically associated with value generated from the IP itself through a transaction with the market. Okay. Fees are more around things that the licensor and the licensee and the licensor exchange between each other. Okay. You can use them in place of royalties. They could be summed up and rolled up in that way. But what we're actually talking here is specifically around things around service incomes, charges, costs, milestone payments, etc., that are associated with achieving a particular activity or incurring a particular cost. Okay. And you may factor them into your calculations for your royalties or a specific event. Okay. But the fees will generally be the terminology that's used for the payment aspect. I want to talk about costs. All right. And so this is a key consideration for the other party is their cost associated with exercising the rights, but also a key consideration for the licensor. And this is where we start to look at who is going to be responsible for maintenance and management and renewals associated with the IP. So the costs that are not directly associated with generating income or deriving value from the IP, but more or less about maintaining the IP rights themselves and maintaining the capacity of what that transaction with this license agreement was about. It's a key question there around who pays those costs, where and when. Are they recoverable? Are they allowed costs? Those types of considerations. And again, they may be factored in the calculations of the fees or the royalties that come back or exchange back between the parties or used as an offset. The final thing is, when do you actually get the payment? Okay. Are they milestone based? Are they going to be performance and trigger based? And we'll talk about milestones, performance and triggers shortly. All right. And there's an aspect around how they're calculated. How should they be done? Are there any conditions or preconditions that are required to support a payment or a claim for payment between the parties? Okay. So you need to think about this key part about the payments. It actually goes into thinking about revenue models, value adds, and understanding this from a financial basis, how it impacts the ability of both parties to realize a return from the IP. It's important. It actually impacts cash flow considerations and important in terms of thinking about when should a payment be due? What's the time frame for the payments to be made? They can be simple or they can be relatively complex. It depends on the relationship that you want to have with your party. It depends on the value of the IP that you're subjecting to a license here at the moment. Let's talk about milestones, performance, and triggers. So milestones, generally, these are going to be event-based activities or key significant events with a measurable objective and outcome associated with them. They can be scheduled, and they will generally be on a schedule basis. They can be one-off events, or they can be a series of sequential and follow-on events. The objectives that you assign with a milestone can be achievements or performance-based. It could be examples that I've put on the screen there. Completion of phase 1 trials. It could be achieving, X amount of dollars in sales. It could be signing the licensing agreement. The outcomes will be a result of completing the milestone. What happens as a result of the milestone being achieved? Is it a payment of fees? Is it a conversion that sits within that? And I'll talk about those in a little bit as they relate to triggers. And notionally, it's always an outcome happens as a result of the milestone. There is a transaction, there is a transfer of value between both parties as a result of achieving a milestone. Some of them are performance-based. So when we start to look at performance considerations, they can be linked to a milestone or overall objectives associated with the licensing arrangement we have. We can think about whether it relates to achievement of specific objectives that we put forward or non-achievement of them as a performance outcome. They can be positive or negative consequences, and they often lead into a trigger. So when I talk about a positive consequence, it might be we've achieved X amount of sales, and therefore we're going to allow you to open up into a new territory or increase your market and applications. It can have a negative consequence. You failed to achieve this level of sales within this time frame, so now we're going to take the license off you, or we're now going to transfer you to a non-exclusive license and allow other people to come in and join the party. Often, performance outcome will lead into some form of trigger, all right? And triggers, this is a terminology that I apply here, but it's essentially about how do you take major and key events that are linked to a milestone in performance and in the contract, and they drive a particular outcome. They generally are condition-based. Hey, we're going to do these sorts of things now. And examples might be a result of payment of fees and non-payment of fees, abandoning commercialization, changing from a license to an assignment relationship. It might actually be, there might be triggers that relate to a changing control of a party. For example, if the party that you're licensing to gets purchased by somebody else, what happens to that license or the IP rights? Okay, there are triggers that come into the longer form agreements that are then available to determine what those changes might be as an event base. What do they mean as significant departures from this relationship from this agreement, the relationship that we've established between ourselves? Examples, cash flow and timing of fees. Recently, I've worked with a startup and looking at their relationship between their intellectual property rights and how they manage that. There's a key consideration in looking at them in terms of they generated revenue from the IP that they had, but they had an IP relationship in place that asked them to pay a fee out to another entity. The process for that in terms of that cash flow is got to think about when does that occur and what is the timing of that payment? How do I factor that into my budget and my planning? And there's a key consideration around understanding what that looks like on a balance sheet in terms of a final financial modeling outcome, and then seeing that transfer to fees. When do I pay fees? When should the cash flow come out of my organization and go to the other party as a result of achieving a particular milestone or a performance event? Understanding the timing of those and the impact of those on cash flow was actually a key part of actually doing forward planning of modeling or budget planning for that entity. Let's talk about ownership and improvements. All right. Ownership is a key consideration because it defines, there are aspects around how it fits with the licensor being the party who controls the IP, and then the licensee, so the person who's granted the right. The assigner, the owner of the IP who assigns ownership or transfers ownership to an assignee. So there's aspect around this ownership principle and how that works for that. And in particular, it's important when we take our body of IP that we have, a la what's in the box, and if we make any changes or improvements to that, who gets ownership to those improvements as a result? And it's a principle for defining that relationship to the improvements, because you can have ownership over the base rights, and then you can have ownership separately and related to, but distinct from or related to the improvements as well. Does it detract or impact their ability to maintain and manage those rights? Do you have to notify the other party? What's the process for telling other people that their improvements have been made and there's a change? All right, and how that impacts the rights. And then what rights and responsibilities each party has in terms of managing ownership of the rights as a whole, and of course the improvements that embed into that as well. With those elements, you start to see that they're probably the main elements that I'd actually highlighted, the key things just to be aware of. There are some other more general things that we need to start thinking about in terms of management. All right. These are relevant to everything I've talked about to this point. Is more relevant to the relationship or the core of what you need to understand in terms of forming that relationship, the key drivers, the key terms that you need to think about. There's some other aspects around it when we start to look at how you actually manage the relationship on an ongoing basis. And they're everything related to the application and responsibility for applying for protection and registration of IP that's related to the agreement. We're talking about registration. So if we have improvements or we have new IP that has protections associated with it, but it's related to the IP under the license, all right, what's the process for registering and maintaining registrations that we have for anything that is a registered component? And that's patents, trademarks, all those elements, designs. What happens in the case of infringement? What are the responsibilities for? Who's monitoring this sort of stuff? How do we identify and undertake infringement and enforcement activities? Which then leads into what are the proceedings? What is the process for taking legal proceedings in those cases? Who's maintaining the IP? Who's maintaining the registration? And then what's the process for renewals? So renewals for any of the applications or the registrations that we have in place. Who's responsible for continuing to payment to keep them up to date and make sure they're ready? Another one I want to talk about is equity. So I talked about royalties, fees, costs, payments. Often we see a relationship where licensing, particularly when we're working with another party, and if we're dealing with a university startup or a spin-out, there's an equity consideration. Can we actually embed the licensing consideration into an equity consideration? It's an important piece. So the licensing element is always an important part of any new venture approach that we take within commercialization of research. Our consideration for what the value is that we get from that licensing arrangement may actually mean not a fee-based outcome. It actually might be in place for equity. And so what we're talking about there is we're talking about exchanging licensing income or the value or the returns from licensing for equity in that new venture. It's useful from a cash flow basis for the venture, but also it's useful because what it does, it actually takes it off the balance of the cash flow model and gives a more freedom to the venture in terms of its management of its cash flow directly. Okay. You're not trading the intellectual property rights for equity. You're actually trading the returns from the intellectual property rights. That's what the basis of this is. So you're not just, okay, in place of not having a license, we want equity. You still have to have the license. The returns or the payment for the realization, the consideration for that is an equity stake in the business in place for any fees that might be paid. What's that worth in an equity conversation? All right. What's the stake that the value of that license and that translation of that income from the returns from the licensing fees would mean an evaluation basis into the entity? If you're working in an institution, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. You can do it on a pure valuation basis. What is the value of the IP? And then you can apply a principles basis. Our standard approach to taking an equity stake is X amount of percent for the licensing fees. Or you might have a combination of both as a determinant. But the key determinants for how you apply that within an institution comes down to a mix of policy and the principles around how you apply valuation. Your institution policies will be the guide for how you should actually go down this journey. Another example, equity for returns. One of the commercialization entities I set up in the past didn't actually take licensing revenue. What it did was that consideration was embodied into an understanding of the value of the startup and how the intellectual property component contributed into the valuation of that company. And then that was the basis for understanding how the returns were represented back to the institute as a result. So there was an investment made, and then there's the value of the IP associated with that venture. How does that represented into the valuation basis or the ownership model that sits within that new venture? And what that did was then took that position and traded or exchanged its rights for licensing returns in terms for an equity position and an equity returns model as a result. So dividends, fees or returns from a trade sale or an exit, as the case may be. A couple of other things to think about. Warranties and indemnities. You'll hear these terms a little bit. The key thing is that what they are is they're representations about the nature of what you've put together. In the first instance, when we talk about a warranty, you're actually warranting the rights are not infringed. So when you see this, you will see this information in a longer form agreement, and they'll talk about whether or not the rights are infringed. You're actually saying that the intellectual property rights are free and clear of any encumbrances or any known impacts that might impact the ability of the other party to derive the value from it. The warrant or a warranty associated with it is generally a precondition for both parties. It can be mutual in both directions, but there's a specific dimension around how it's a precondition for both parties at the establishment of the agreement. Once we move into the operation of the agreement, the other part we start to look at is indemnify, all right? And that's where we start to look at how indemnification applies in the event that there are any issues associated with once the agreement is in place. They can be mutual, and then one party does something wrong, right? There can be aspects around how that might not apply, all right, or indemnify the other party associated with it. Reporting and auditing. When we talk about reporting, what's the reporting component that we expect to receive back? All right. It can be related to performance and payment and compliance with the terms of the agreement. And it's often related to where reporting is required associated with events and periodicals. So I talked about support from milestone, those elements. And it's a range of different aspects around how you actually get information about the performance of the IP, the performance of the license and the relationship. The other side of the table is how do you know that the performance is up to scratch? And what that does is the basis of giving you confidence and traceability that, you know, the IP and the relationship is performing as intended. And it validates that agreement. And the key question around that is that also when you think about the audit, who does the audit, who bears the costs for the audit, and what does it mean as a result? In applying reporting and auditing, think about what's reasonable, practical, enforceable, and useful. Think about the objective you need to achieve in terms of the licensing arrangement that you have, and go and get some advice. Some other legal considerations, just remember that what you're trying to put in place is a contract. You know? And there are going to be common regular terms and structures consistent with what you will see in any contractual agreement. There's going to be notices, there's going to be termination and a few other bits and pieces like that. There's specific requirements associated with normally see in agreements. And there might be a few more as well. Okay, getting to an agreement, how do you get to a basis for negotiation? So once you understand all those licensing considerations, those big ones that I talked about, exclusive, non-exclusive, fields and territories, royalties, ownership, do you want equity, who's managing what information? Okay. This is where you start to think about actually putting those key elements, the important elements of that relationship, and defining it into a term sheet. And you use a term sheet ahead of a full agreement because a full agreement is difficult to have a conversation around because it's structured as a contract. It's useful if you know the ins and outs of what you're doing, but if that's not the nature of the conversation you want to have, and you just want to get to the key parts of the agreement or the basis for the relationship, then you start with a term sheet because you get to outline the key terms or the key topics for that, the essentials for that transaction, and then are able to then take that and apply that into, provide that advice back into the people who can help you fill the final agreement out. And you're trying to work in plain language terms that work back into the agreement. The term sheet is the basis for conversation negotiation, and it's a precursor to a full and final agreement. They can be binding. What does that mean? It means that it's enforceable. More likely, what they are going to be is they're going to be non-binding. You can't actually be held to account on the basis of a term sheet. It's not until you get to the final agreement that you execute the agreement, that's where the relationship is formalized. It's not the entire agreement, it's those key elements. And you use it as a reference for your key licensing considerations. So all those terms that I talked about before, generally that's what you're going to find dealing with in a term sheet. Or there's types of topics you need to be able to talk to the other party about in a term sheet. And you might use the search schedules that associate the full agreement will come through to capture that key content. So you might have a schedule on timing of payments and the types of royalties that are paid. That's in the agreement. That actually might form part of your term sheet. So they become your working templates, your working information. That's where you start to build out what that relationship will look like without being confused by the whole agreement. Your commercialization team is generally going to be on the front foot for this and help you manage that, and will likely manage that activity associated with the term sheet and the negotiation, the conversation that needs to happen. Key tip, just remember that a term sheet, use it as a basis for conversation and negotiation. It's not the contract, okay? You should actually expose that the agreement is going to be there at some point in time and give people line of sight to that. But the nature of the conversation, you should actually do that on the basis of the term sheet style structure. And I'm just going to touch very quickly through all of those elements that we talked about previously and how they might pop up in a term sheet itself. And that's what you might consider. All right. So you've got the general aspects around background. You're talking about licensor and assigner, i.e. the party who currently owns or controls the IP. In most cases, that's going to be the institute to start with. Okay. The licensee, the assignee, that's the other party on the other side of the exchange or the contract or the transaction we're trying to do. The term, how long will this agreement be in place? What is in the IP? So when I talk about the box, you've actually got a schedule, and this is where you'll start to see a schedule that will define this information associated with the agreement. This is where that information comes together. This is what gets told. This is what the scope of what the IP rights cover. Okay? You've got information about fields and territory. I talked about those earlier, what they are. And then the grant. So what is the right that they're actually being granted to the licensee? It's the key term, all right? There's an example there, but it's about what are they allowed to do? And it might be all rights to develop, manufacture, use, and sell products using the licensed intellectual property in the field, in the territory. Note that they point to the other references for what that information says. But this is actually the right. This is the heart of the matter of what you're actually talking about. What are they allowed to do? Then you start to talk about license back and enduring rights. So this is a terminology that's associated with whether or not there's any enduring rights on the licensor or the assigner to continue to use the IP for whatever purpose it might be. Okay. Is there a license back on assignment? So if you transfer ownership to an assignee, do you get the rights, or is there a license back to use it for as a result, so it can continue to use value or derive value from the research? You might even require it if your relationship is to support the new owner of the IP with a research framework agreement or something. And of course, then there's that aspect around ownership of improvement. I mentioned before about understanding management, maintenance, and renewals. So you're trying to define the responsibility of who will have responsibility for ongoing applications, infringements, and then managing registration and protection and whatnot. There's costs associated with it. Who's going to cover that? You might combine both of these descriptions together. What is the value transaction here? What is the money as a result of executing those rights? What do you get as a return? How are they defined? And again, you'll generally have a schedule that might actually define what this looks like. You've got the provisions around reporting and auditing, how that might work, a description around warranties, talk about the term. Is it a closed or open-ended relationship? What happens if it's terminated? Okay. What happens at the ceasing the agreement? What happens there? There might be some aspects or provisions to think about there. Are there exclusivity constraints for this negotiation? Not the license, but for this conversation that we're having that's on the basis of this term sheet. And importantly, are there any conditions precedents or conditions or outcomes that we need to satisfy before the agreement takes effect? And they might be that we need to complete a proof of concept, or we need to achieve a particular outcome, or we need a patent granted or submitted for this to occur before we sign off on the agreement. These topics are what you might see in a term sheet and you should consider, but there's generally a version that will sit within your organizations which will have aspects or elements of these and possibly some more. Okay. The key question when you look at those elements, do the terms actually match the opportunity and the plan you're putting together? I talked about the licensing plan and what we're trying to achieve. The opportunity that drives that plan. Do these things come together? Do they stitch together? Are they workable and are they reasonable? Okay. What I'll do is just very quickly talk about market drivers. It's the basis for your licensing considerations in any agreement. And there's always a market driver that sits behind it. How much could the product services generate based on the IP generated, where and when? And what's the value of it? And the markets are a key factor in determining the key elements that sit within your licensing considerations. So I talked on, in particular, about fields, territory, and payments. And our next session is going to help us work that out, which is going to be, how do you size a potential market? We'll go to Q&A, but I'll just leave this on the screen. So this is other news this week out of UQ. Very great outcome. Well done to the crowd. Congratulations to that team for that particular outcome, where they had direct investment and they got licensing from a vaccine platform technology developed at UQ. Well done. Congratulations to them.
Perfect. Thank
Kelly.
you very much, Ken. That was great. We'll try to squeeze a couple questions in to everyone on. I have launched the poll if you could fill that out. It's super quick, just 3 questions for some feedback. But we do have 3 notes in the comments. So the first from Fiona was wondering, in principle, am I right that licensing is possible even where you have no patents, but just non-patent forms of IP?
Yes, absolutely. You can do that. If you can identify the intellectual property or the rights or everything that's resolved that down, it doesn't have to be a patent. It doesn't have to be registered. So if you're dealing with trade secrets, for example, something that's undercover, under wraps, that you don't want to disclose, then certainly, and you can actually identify that, then certainly you can license those, provided you can define them. You don't actually have to have had a patent for them or register them.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And then from Christine, is there any disadvantage of having a lengthy exclusive license to IP over ownership of IP?
The worst kind of answer is it depends. In reality, exactly that. It depends. It's a market-driven outcome, and it depends on the party you're working with and the degree of risk or confidence you have that is the right relationship to have. Again, you're coming to a point of trying to establish a relationship between parties. What is that nature? What is the type of relationship that you need to have to realize value from that? If you shorten that up, are you certain about the relationship you want? There are different ways to think about that, but ultimately it comes back to what is the nature of the relationship you are trying to establish to take advantage of the market opportunity that helps you realize the value from the intellectual property that you put together.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I do have a second question. It's the last one I have here. I'm just wondering, could you enter into a licensing agreement while you, the inventor, are still undertaking your next R&D cycle on the invention?
There's a number of inputs that go into that. So that's when you actually start to look at what's the relationship, or we talk about rights. And I mentioned about being able to warrant that you have the rights. What is the nature of first of all, if you're doing research and development, it's contract research, or you're doing it under some form of a relationship, what are the provisions that sit within that in terms of who owns and controls the IP as a result? If you have the rights over that, then certainly you can have a conversation around whether or not you think there's value in pursuing a licensing arrangement as a result. But the key thing is, remember what I said about warrant? You've got to confirm that you've actually got the rights to start that conversation.
Great. Thank you. I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Ken, very much, and for everyone that joined today.